The room smelled like old paper and cold light, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, just controlled. Velerin preferred it that way. He had spent 31 years inside the Bureau of Sophan Classification, and in that time he had learned a simple truth: the universe made more sense when nothing tried to distract you from it. No windows, no decoration, only data and the steady hum of machines translating chaos into order. He opened the file on his screen. Third planet from a yellow star. One moon. Mostly water. Atmosphere breathable. That alone already placed it in the rare category of worlds that didn't immediately kill the observer. Out of 62 species he had catalogued, 41 could not breathe what they lived in. He always considered that an unfortunate design flaw. He began reading the preliminary report prepared by his assistant, Mara F. Young, precise, careful. The kind of analyst who did not waste words because she respected what words were used for. The species was labeled human. The name felt soft when he read it. Harmless even. That was often the first mistake in classification, but he did not think about that yet. Bipedal. Bilaterally symmetrical. Average height within expected range for a mid-planetary civilization. Lifespan 70 to 90 cycles. Almost aggressively short, like something burning faster than it should. They were warm-blooded. That detail always mattered. Warm-blooded species tended to behave differently under stress. Emotional responses were more common. Predictable patterns less so. He continued. They had language. Not one. Many. Over 6,000 recorded variations. That suggested fragmentation, isolation, independent development across geography. Not unusual. They had art. Music. Painting. Sculpture. Things created without function. That was always interesting. A species that produced things with no survival value usually meant cognition had started exploring itself instead of just the environment. They had religion as well. Multiple systems of belief layered across regions and time. Again, not unique. Then he reached the section on conflict. He paused, not because it was unusual, but because it always required context. War was not an anomaly. It was a phase almost every intelligent species passed through. Early competition for resources, identity formation, territorial definition. Even the Laurenti had once done it before they stopped documenting that period in public archives. So he moved on. The humans had nuclear energy, global communication networks, orbital presence around their own moon. They had even left physical traces there. Footprints still preserved in vacuum, like a memory frozen in stone. Velerin leaned back slightly. Curious. Not advanced enough for interstellar travel, but close enough that the trajectory was obvious. A species building toward something without knowing exactly what shape it would take. He began writing his assessment. Mid-development civilization. Late conflict phase of social evolution. Aggression appears culturally influenced rather than biologically fixed. Given stability and contact, intergroup violence should decline over time. High creative intelligence. High adaptability. Strong social bonding patterns. Recommendation: initiate first contact protocol. He reviewed it once, then sent it. Across the hall, Mara Eth received the confirmation that her report had been accepted without modification. She felt a familiar hesitation. Not doubt exactly. Just unfinished thought. She reopened the biological section of the human file. One detail kept pulling her attention back. The shoulder joint. She had studied dozens of species. 43 skeletal systems in total. None of them matched the range of motion humans possessed in that structure. It was not just flexible. It was engineered in a way that prioritized a very specific type of movement. Throwing. She ran the simulations again. The efficiency was not normal. It was extreme. Overbuilt. Excessive in a way evolution rarely produced without pressure. She checked historical data. 2 million years. That was how far back the pattern went. Evidence of repeated, precise throwing behavior. Not random. Not symbolic. Targeted. Controlled. Repetitive across generations. Not survival motion. Combat motion. She hesitated before adding a note. The system flagged it as observational only. She submitted it anyway, then went to lunch. Later that day, Velerin saw it attached to his original report. A small addendum. Easy to ignore. Easy to dismiss. But he didn't. He opened it. Read the first line. Shoulder joint structure indicates optimized kinetic projection capability. He frowned slightly and continued. Throwing efficiency exceeds all comparable bipedal species by a significant margin. Archaeological record confirms usage spanning over 2 million cycles. He stopped. Reopened the human file. Scrolled deeper. Pain response. Above expected threshold tolerance. Stress response. Abnormal hormonal acceleration under threat conditions. Not suppression. Enhancement. He read that line twice. Under extreme pressure, cognitive and physical performance increases rather than degrades. That was not a defect. That was a design principle. He closed the file. Then opened it again. Something in the data no longer felt like classification. It felt like misinterpretation. He began a new private note. At what point does cultural aggression become structural behavior rather than learned pattern? He did not send it. He saved it. Then sat still for a long time in a room that suddenly felt less like a workplace and more like a sealed observation chamber. Far away, Earth continued rotating without awareness that it had just been read incorrectly. And for the first time in 31 years, Velerin wondered whether harmless had ever been the correct first impression at all. The council chamber was large enough to make silence feel intentional. Not empty. Controlled. Every surface was designed for clarity of thought, or at least the appearance of it. Velerin stood at the center platform, watching representatives settle into their places with the calm certainty of beings who believed history usually followed predictable patterns. He had presented here before. Many times. And in all those times, nothing he had said had ever truly. Systems, the phrasing had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. We extend ourselves toward you. In several languages, the structure implied motion toward a subject. Approach. Advance. Reach. In one system, the translation engine flagged ambiguity and defaulted to caution framing. Incoming external directive, proximity escalation detected. Within hours, human governments responded. Not uniformly, but quickly. Too quickly for ambiguity to settle. Emergency protocols activated across multiple regions. Defense systems shifted to elevated readiness. Communication channels opened between nations that rarely coordinated at that speed. The quorum observed all of it, and misread it as organization, not alarm. Velerin received the early behavioral report while still in transit between review chambers. He studied it without immediate concern. High-speed coordination across distributed political systems. Temporary alignment of response behavior. Suggests exposure to external diplomatic signal and structured interpretation. He marked it as expected stress response. Then moved on. On the diplomatic vessel, Taurex noticed something unusual. Human silence. Not absence of communication. Activity was everywhere. Signals flooded space. But none of it was directed outward in a stable, readable form. It was internal. Confined. Like a species speaking rapidly to itself without allowing outsiders to hear the conclusion. She requested clarification from analysis. The system responded. Human intent not clearly distinguishable. High variance interpretation across observed regions. That should have been the first warning. But it was not. Because variance was normal in early contact scenarios. Later that same cycle, a second transmission was received. This one originated from Earth's outer monitoring stations. It described an object approaching the solar boundary. Unidentified. Moving with structural precision inconsistent with natural formation. Human analysts escalated it immediately. Within 4 hours, the information had passed through multiple national command structures. Within 6, several planetary defense systems were activated. Within 12, the quorum classified it as environmental anomaly response behavior. Preparedness, not fear. Velerin reviewed the updated file and noted only one thing. Human systems respond to uncertainty with rapid structural coordination. He added it to the profile. Meanwhile, on Earth, interpretation diverged further. The Quorum's second broadcast arrived during this period. A formal diplomatic acknowledgement, a reassurance of peaceful intent, a structured invitation to dialogue. But translation systems, already strained by layered interpretation errors, rendered key phrases inconsistently. One segment translated as, "We observe your readiness." Another as, "We acknowledge your defensive posture." And a third, across several systems, reduced it to, "We are already here." That last line did not originate from the Quorum message. It was an artifact of compression error. But it was widely circulated, and it changed tone. Human response did not escalate into panic. Refined, subtle shifts in posture, quiet reallocation of resources, strategic adjustments without public declaration. The Quorum recorded this as stability under observation. Velerin, however, paused longer than he had before. Because the pattern no longer matched early contact baselines. It matched something else. Containment behavior. Like a system preparing without revealing what it was preparing for. He reopened Mara F's earlier notes. The shoulder joint analysis. The throwing optimization curves. The stress response acceleration graphs. And something began to align in his mind that he did not yet have language for. Not aggression. Not diplomacy. But endurance architecture. On the diplomatic vessel, Taurex initiated direct contact protocol. A human representative responded. Commander Daniel Oe. He arrived alone. No escort. No visible weapons. He walked into the meeting chamber as though he had already decided it belonged to him. Taurex began formal introduction. He listened. Perfectly still. Not passive. Focused. Every word she spoke was processed without interruption. When she finished, he asked a single question. "What did you mean when you said you were already here?" The translator hesitated, then rendered the Quorum phrase again. Taurex clarified. "We are in your system to initiate peaceful contact." Oe did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied her. Not emotionally. Structurally. Like someone examining intent through pattern rather than expression. Then he said, "You entered our space without permission. You broadcast messages we had to decode under pressure. And you observed our response without telling us you were watching." The pause. Not emotional. Measured. And now you're calling it peace. Taurex attempted clarification. The Quorum had followed standard protocol. Passive observation was not interference. It was precaution. It was safety. Oe tilted his head slightly. That depends on which side of it you're on. The phrase did not translate cleanly. But the meaning did. And it introduced something into the chamber that had not been present before. Framing conflict. Not as misunderstanding, but as perspective. For the first time, Taurex adjusted her internal assessment. Not of humanity. Of predictability models. Meanwhile, Velerin received a new dataset. It was small, but it changed everything in how he began reading the rest. Human historical military response patterns were no longer linear. They were adaptive. Not in strategy. In structure. Each engagement produced behavioral revision. Not at leadership level. At system level. Units learned. And the learning propagated. He stared at that for a long time. Then wrote one line in his private notes. This is not a civilization reacting to war. This is a system rewriting itself during war. And for the first time, he did not feel confident that classification had been merely incomplete. He felt, instead, that it had been fundamentally inverted. The war did not begin with a declaration. It began with a misalignment. Not of intent, but of interpretation. When the Quorum strike impacted Earth's lunar surface, it was labeled internally as a controlled demonstration. A warning. A geometrically precise message intended to communicate superiority without escalation. On Earth, it was not received as geometry. It was received as event. And events do not negotiate. They trigger responses. For 22 hours after the strike, Earth did not broadcast a unified reply. There were no surrender signals, no panic transmission, no collapse of communication networks as the Quorum expected from historical models of less advanced civilizations under shock. Instead, There was silence filled with structure. Encrypted coordination. Rapid internal realignment. Decision-making compressed across systems that had never before been forced into shared tempo. Velerin saw the first analysis report and did not initially recognize its significance. He had expected reaction. He was seeing organization. Not chaos. Not collapse. Coordination. He adjusted the classification to stress stabilization phase and moved on. That was his first mistake. The second mistake belonged to Orin. Fleet Commander Orin did not believe in unpredictability. He believed in ratios. Force distribution. Engagement probability curves. Everything could be modeled if enough variables were known. And the Quorum had more ships. That was the only variable he trusted completely. When he authorized the expansion of fleet presence around Earth, it was not emotional. It was mathematical. 4,000 ships against 40 remaining human vessels. The outcome was not a question. It was a function. The first engagements confirmed the model. Human ships were smaller. Faster but fragile. Their losses were immediate. Structural failures occurred under direct Quorum fire exactly as predicted. The early reports were clean. Too clean. Velerin noticed this before others did, but did not yet have a reason to escalate concern. Humans were losing. That was expected. But something in the loss pattern was not repeating. On most civilizations, early engagement behavior stabilizes quickly. They find a tactic. They repeat it until it fails. Then they collapse or retreat. Humans did neither. On day 4, their formations changed. On day 7, their engagement vectors shifted. On day 12, they began attacking from directions that had been classified as low-probability zones. Not random. Not experimental. Observed. Learned. Adapted. Velerin began annotating the changes personally. He had never done that before. By day 19, the Quorum lost its first vessel. The engagement report was reviewed 3 times before confirmation. Human squadron. 6 ships. Outgunned. Outnumbered. Statistically non-viable engagement parameters. And yet they entered anyway. The lead human ship absorbed direct fire and continued moving. Not surviving in the traditional sense. Continuing despite structural failure thresholds being exceeded. That was the line that appeared in the report. Continuing despite structural failure thresholds being exceeded. Velerin read it twice. Then again. Because systems do not continue past failure thresholds. They stop. Or they break. But this did neither. He pulled up Mara F's biological profile again. Pain tolerance. Stress response acceleration. Hormonal override behavior under threat conditions. And suddenly, those lines stopped looking like isolated traits. They started forming a system. On day 25, Orin requested additional fleet units. On day 30, the Quorum had increased deployment to 4,300 ships. The human fleet, initially reduced to near extinction levels, now registered 400-plus active vessels. The growth was not linear. It was responsive. Every loss created structure. Every defeat created refinement. Velerin wrote in his private log. They are not preserving capability. They are generating it under pressure. Mara F arrived in his office that same day without waiting for acknowledgement. She placed updated behavioral charts on his desk. She did not speak immediately. Then she said, "They are not repeating mistakes." He nodded. "They are not capable of repetition under stress." She corrected herself. "They are incapable of static behavior under sustained threat." Silence followed. Then she added something quieter. "That means the longer this continues, the less predictable they become." Velerin looked at the data again. Fleet numbers. Engagement vectors. Doctrine evolution frequency. 7 major tactical shifts in under 30 days. No recorded species in Quorum history had ever changed battlefield doctrine mid-conflict more than once. Humans had done it 7 times. Then Velerin said something he did not yet fully believe himself. "We are not fighting their military." Mara F looked at him. "We are fighting their learning process." On Earth, Commander Oe stood in front of the Quorum diplomatic vessel after the failed first engagement negotiations. He had returned without anger. Without urgency. Only clarity. When Taurex attempted explanation, he listened. When she offered peace terms, he analyzed them. When she mentioned observation protocols, he paused and said, "You've been watching us long enough to know what we are." The pause. But not long enough to understand what happens when we stop pretending we are stable. That sentence was not translated correctly. But it was understood. Not intellectually. Structurally. Because something in it aligned with every battlefield report the Quorum had begun to receive. Humans did not degrade under pressure. They reorganized. Later that cycle, Velerin received a classified update. Human production capacity had increased again. Ship construction rates had doubled. Then doubled again. Not through infrastructure expansion alone. Through process acceleration. Distributed coordination systems were self-optimizing under conflict conditions. He stared at the report longer than he should have. Because now the pattern was no longer unclear. It was just unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity, in systems built on classification, is the first stage of misclassification failure. He wrote one final line before submitting his interim report. If sustained pressure continues, human capability does not converge. It diverges. Then he closed the file. And for the first time since the beginning of contact, he stopped thinking about humans as a developing civilization, and started thinking about them as something that had never been static in the first place. Velerin did not sleep. Not because he could not. Because every time he closed his eyes, the same pattern returned. Human data, reorganizing itself under pressure. Not breaking. Not stabilizing. Evolving. The council chamber smelled different now. Not physically. Structurally. It was the same recycled air, the same controlled lighting, the same precision-built silence. But nothing in it felt stable anymore. Velerin stood at the center again, but this time he was not presenting a classification. He was presenting a correction. The council was fully assembled. That alone signaled severity. Orin was present again, arms folded, expression unchanged but sharper than before. Mara Eth stood slightly behind Velerin. She had not been invited to speak, but no one had asked her to leave. That, in itself, was also a signal. Velerin began. He did not start with conclusions. He never did. He started with what they already believed. Every species we have encountered follows a predictable developmental curve. Early aggression phase. Cultural stabilization. Technological expansion. Post-conflict equilibrium. He paused. That model is correct. Then he added, it is not complete. A few council members shifted slightly. Not alarmed. Interested. Velerin projected the human conflict data. Fleet engagement logs. Doctrine change frequency. Production scaling curves. Then he stopped labeling them as military data and started labeling them as behavioral response systems. Humans do not maintain stable doctrine during sustained conflict. They do not iterate after engagement cycles. They iterate during them. The room grew quieter. Orin finally spoke. That is adaptation under pressure. All species do that. Velerin nodded. Yes. Then he changed the display. But not like this. He highlighted a sequence. Day 1 to Day 10, predictable engagement response. Day 11 to Day 19, tactical deviation emergence. Day 20 onward, real-time doctrine replacement. Then he zoomed in further. Human units were not executing orders in isolation. They were exchanging successful survival patterns between engagements. Not centrally. Not hierarchically. Horizontally. Across active combat zones. Mara Eth stepped forward slightly. They are learning collectively while under fire. Velerin corrected her softly. They are learning collectively because they are under fire. That distinction mattered. The council representative from Velkai leaned forward. And you believe this is unprecedented? Velerin did not answer immediately, because the word unprecedented was no longer sufficient. Finally he said, no known species demonstrates accelerated structural intelligence under sustained existential threat. The pause. Humans do. Orin exhaled slowly. Not in relief. In calculation. How long until their fleet equals ours? Velerin brought up projections. Then hesitated. Because projections had changed. Not linearly. Exponentially. Based on current production adaptation rates and doctrine efficiency gains, human fleet parity window had compressed from 60 days to approximately 18 to 22 days. Silence. Not disbelief. Recalibration. One council member spoke carefully. That is impossible given their initial industrial baseline. Mara F answered before Velerin could. It was impossible at their initial baseline. She emphasized initial. Then added, it is no longer their baseline. That was the second structural shift in the room. The realization that human systems did not scale. They transformed. Velerin continued. There is another factor. He hesitated again. This one was harder. Not because of data. Because of implication. He changed the display. Psychological bonding response under sustained threat. Every known species showed fragmentation under prolonged conflict exposure. Internal trust degradation. Command breakdown. Social disintegration. Humans showed the opposite curve. Group cohesion increased with duration of threat exposure. Not slightly. Exponentially. He displayed battlefield communication logs. Humans were coordinating across damaged networks, fractured infrastructure, and disrupted command chains. And still maintaining coherence. Not through control. Through shared adaptation. Oren's voice was quieter now. That is not a military structure. Velerin nodded. No. Then he said it. It is an organism. That word changed the atmosphere in the chamber. Not emotionally. Conceptually. Because organisms do not surrender. They do not negotiate. They persist. The council representative from Laurenti finally spoke. So what are we dealing with? Velerin looked at the data for a long moment before answering. A species that treats survival pressure as input. The pause. And produces capability as output. He let that settle. Then added, the longer we apply pressure, the more capable they become. Oren's expression tightened slightly. Then we escalate until they break. Velerin looked at him. And this time there was something in his tone that had not been there before. They do not break in the way we understand breaking. Silence again. Mara Eth spoke softly. They don't stop under stress. She corrected herself. They improve. That was when the council stopped treating the situation as a conflict. And started treating it as a miscalculation. Velerin brought up one final dataset. Archaeological behavioral continuity. 2 million years of evidence. Not of peace. Not of war. Of persistence. Every environmental pressure event in human history correlated with expansion of capability afterward. Every extinction-level predator period correlated with refinement of hunting strategy. Every climate collapse correlated with migration and adaptation rather than contraction. He said it plainly. They were not shaped by stability. The pause. They were shaped by resistance. He closed the display, then added quieter. And they have never stopped encountering it. For the first time, no one responded immediately. Because the implication had shifted. They were not observing a developing civilization. They were inside a system that had never stopped responding to pressure for its entire existence. Later, when the council adjourned, Oren remained behind. Velerin did not leave immediately either. The room emptied slowly. When only they remained, Oren finally spoke. If we stop pressure, they stabilize? Velerin considered the question carefully. Then answered honestly. There is no evidence they have ever existed without pressure long enough to establish a stable baseline. That was the final line. The one neither of them spoke after. On his way back, Velerin passed Marith. She was looking at something on her data pad. He asked without stopping. What is it? She hesitated. Then turned the screen toward him. It was a recording from Earth. A child. Playing. Using a stick like a weapon. Making explosion sounds with her mouth. Then laughing. Running. Switching games without pause. She had labeled it privately. Behavioral inheritance pattern. Velerin looked at it for a long time. then said nothing. Because now he understood something that did not fit in any classification system the Quorum had ever built. Humanity was not becoming something. It was continuing something. And whatever it was continuing had never stopped. The negotiation stations sat at the edge of the system like a neutral thought placed between two inevitabilities. Neither side trusted that word anymore. Neutral. Velerin arrived early. He always arrived early now. Not out of discipline, but because waiting had started to feel like watching a calculation finish itself in real time. The station corridors were quieter than usual. Not empty. Like everyone inside understood that whatever happened in the next few hours would not be reversed by procedure or protocol afterward. Mara Eth walked beside him without speaking. She had stopped filling silence with analysis 2 days ago. Not because she had run out of conclusions. Because conclusions had stopped staying stable long enough to matter. The meeting chamber was already active when they entered. Quorum delegates on one side. Human delegation on the other. No ceremonial positioning. No symbolic distance. Just two systems placed in the same room and forced to acknowledge they had reached the same point from entirely different directions. Commander Daniel Oae sat at the center of the human side. Still as before. Not relaxed. Not tense. Controlled in a way that suggested control was not something he was applying. It was something he simply did not release. Velerin noticed something immediately. The humans were not armed. But that no longer meant anything. He had learned that. Arms were no longer where their capability lived. The Quorum side began with formalities. Taurex spoke first. Carefully constructed language. Structured intent. Acknowledgement of prior conflict. Expression of desire for resolution. Every word correct. Every word insufficient. Oe listened without interruption. When she finished, he did not respond immediately. He looked at the Quorum representatives for a long moment. Not scanning. Not judging. Measuring. Then he spoke. You called it observation. The pause. We called it exposure. Silence tightened slightly. Not emotional. Structural. Because framing had shifted again. He continued. You said you were studying us. Another pause. We were surviving you doing it. Velerin felt the room adjust to that sentence. Not emotionally. Cognitively. Because it reframed every prior assumption about neutrality. Taurex responded carefully. Our intent was not harm. Oae nodded once. I believe that. Then added. That is not the same as safety. The translator hesitated on that line, but delivered it intact. Velerin watched Mara Eth at that moment. She had gone very still. Not in shock. In recognition. Oae leaned forward slightly. You see us as a developing system. The pause. We see you as a repeating one. That line did not translate cleanly either, but its meaning did. Because it implied pattern awareness on both sides. And pattern awareness removes innocence from interpretation. Taurex tried again. We are offering integration, protection, and mutual advancement. Oae tilted his head slightly. And what do you call what happens when we say no? Silence. Because that question had already been answered. On Earth. At the moment the lunar surface was struck. Taurex did not respond immediately. Because there was no protocol for answering that question without revealing structural asymmetry. Velerin felt it then. The shift. The moment diplomacy stopped being language and started being geometry. Oae continued. You assumed we would respond like previous civilizations. The pause. But you didn't ask whether we were responding at all. He tapped the table once. Lightly. Controlled. And you never noticed we were already reorganizing before your first message finished translating. That was the moment Velerin understood something he had not allowed himself to fully articulate. Humans were not reacting to contact. They were incorporating it. Everything. Threat. Communication. Observation. Conflict. All of it became input. And input became adaptation. Taurex spoke softly now. Then what do you want? Oae looked at her for a long time. Not as a diplomat. Not as an enemy. As something closer to a system interface trying to determine whether another system was compatible or merely temporary. Then he said, We don't want to be studied without consent. The pause. We don't want to be corrected. Another pause. And we don't want to be tested. Silence. But we want the boundary respected. Velerin felt that sentence settled differently than anything before it, because it was not a request. It was a condition. Not emotional. Structural. Taurex responded carefully. And if that boundary is crossed? Oe did not hesitate. Then you already know what we become. That was not a threat. It was a reference to history. Velerin looked down briefly. Because suddenly every data set he had reviewed was reorganizing itself under a new assumption. Not that humans were evolving, but that they had always responded to pressure the same way, and that nothing in their record suggested that response had ever stopped scaling. The meeting continued for hours, but the outcome had already been determined in the first 20 minutes. By the end, the quorum agreement was rewritten, not as integration, not as oversight, but as recognition. Human sovereignty was not granted. It was acknowledged. The difference mattered a great deal. When the session ended, Oe stood first. He did not look relieved. He did not look victorious. He looked finished. Like someone who had said what needed to be said and no longer required the conversation to continue. As he left, he passed Velerin. He stopped for a fraction of a second. Looked at him. Not hostile. Not friendly. Simply aware. Then he said quietly, "You almost got it right." Velerin did not respond. Because he understood what almost meant in that context. It meant close enough to misjudge. After the humans left, the chamber remained silent. For a long time. Taurex finally broke it. They are not a war species. No one corrected her. Because the classification had already been broken. Maraeth spoke softly from behind Velerin. They are a pressure species. Velerin nodded slowly. Yes. Then added, "And we are the pressure." That line stayed in the room longer than anything else said that day. Later, as Velerin returned through the station corridors, he passed observation windows looking out at Earth. A small blue world. Quite indifferent. And for the first time since classification began, he did not see it as a subject of study. He saw it as a closed system. One that had spent millions of years learning a single behavior. Do not stop. Not under threat. Not under loss. Not under time. And somewhere deep in that realization, something very old in his understanding of intelligence quietly revised itself. Because intelligence, he realized, was not what separated species. What separated them was what they became under pressure. And humanity had never had the luxury of becoming anything else. The war did not end the way wars were supposed to end in quorum history. There was no final engagement. No decisive collapse. No moment where one side stopped and the other declared itself victorious. Instead, there was a gradual realization that the shape of the conflict had changed faster than the system could name it. Humanity was no longer reacting to the war. They were absorbing it. Every strike, every loss, every engagement became internalized as structure. Not trauma. Not disruption. Refinement. Velerin saw it first in the production data. Human shipbuilding output had not plateaued. It had decoupled from resource expectation models entirely. Factories that should have reached maximum capacity were exceeding it through process redesign that no centralized system had issued. He read the reports 3 times before he accepted what they were saying. Human industry was not scaling. It was reorganizing itself around constraint. On day 52 of the conflict, the quorum fleet numbers still showed superiority. But the ratio no longer behaved like superiority. It behaved like delay. Oren understood this before he admitted it publicly. He stopped calling for reinforcement expansion. Not because the numbers had changed. Because the shape of the outcome had. Velerin was called back to the council. This time, there was no presentation. Only questions. How long until parity? What is their maximum sustainable growth ceiling? What is their psychological collapse threshold? Velerin did not answer immediately, because each of those questions assumed something that no longer appeared supported by data. Finally he said, "There is no observed ceiling." That line caused no immediate reaction. Because councils do not respond to absence of data. They respond to presence of certainty. Mara F. added quietly, "We are no longer measuring escalation. We are measuring transformation speed." That was when the council stopped asking when the humans would break, and started asking whether they ever would. On Earth, Commander OA reviewed quorum transmissions without urgency. Not because they were unimportant, because urgency no longer matched the state of the system. Human fleets had stabilized. Not reduced. Stabilized. At a scale that no longer reflected survival. But presence. A new equilibrium had formed. Not peace. Not war. Something else. Sustained readiness. A condition where conflict was no longer an event. It was background capability. Velerin saw this in the psychological data. Human stress response curves had not returned to baseline after conflict exposure. They had stabilized at a higher functional band. Pain suppression mechanisms remained elevated. Cognitive processing efficiency under simulated threat conditions remained enhanced even during non-combat periods. He stared at that graph for a long time. Because it meant something simple. And something impossible. Humans did not return to normal after pressure. They adopted pressure-adjusted normality as baseline. That was not recovery. That was evolution without reset. The Council convened one final emergency session. Not to decide war strategy, but to decide classification. Velerin stood at the center again. But this time he did not bring predictions. He brought revision. He began with the simplest statement he had ever made in his career. We misclassified the fundamental nature of this species. Silence. Not disagreement. Tension. He continued. We assumed aggression was a phase. The pause. It is not. He changed the display. 2 million years of behavioral continuity. Tool use before agriculture. Projectile optimization before language. Endurance hunting patterns preceding structured civilization. Every data point aligned in a way that no longer suggested development stages. It suggested continuity of function. He spoke more carefully now. We assumed war was a cultural artifact. Another pause. It is a biological pressure response system. Mara F. stepped forward. And that system does not degrade under use. She looked at the Council. It improves. That word landed harder than expected. Because improvement under stress was not a known evolutionary strategy at that scale. Orin finally spoke. So what are we dealing with now? Velerin answered honestly. A species that treats sustained pressure as information processing. He hesitated, then added, and produces structural capability as output. A council member asked quietly, and if pressure continues indefinitely? Velerin did not look at the display this time. He looked at the room, at all of them, at the question itself. Then there is no final form. Silence followed. Not emotional. Structural recalibration. Because that statement removed the assumption of endpoint. Without endpoint, there is no victory condition. Without victory condition, war becomes something else entirely. Later, after the session ended, Mara F. walked beside Velerin through the corridor. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally she said, We built our strategy around the idea that all systems saturate. Velerin nodded slowly. Yes. She continued. They don't. Another pause. Then softer. Not this one. Velerin stopped walking for a moment. Looked out at the distant view of Earth through observation glass. A small planet continuing its rotation without reference to any external observer. Then he said, The mistake was assuming we were observing a civilization. He paused. We were observing a response system that has never stopped responding. Mara F. did not reply. Because there was nothing left in the classification framework that could contain what that meant. In the final archived report submitted to the quorum, Velerin wrote only one concluding sentence. It was not dramatic. It was not poetic. It was precise. We did not encounter a species that becomes violent under pressure. We encountered a species that becomes more of itself under pressure. And pressure has never been something they learned to fear. It is something they learned to use. The quorum did not declare victory. They did not declare defeat either. They simply stopped using the word war. Because by day 67, the term no longer described the situation accurately in any of their internal models. What had begun as a controlled engagement had evolved into something without a clean category boundary. Human systems were no longer being pushed into adaptation. They were actively shaping the environment that was pushing them. Velerin saw it first in the tactical drift logs. Quorum fleets were no longer encountering predictable resistance patterns. They were encountering absence of repetition. Every engagement, no matter how small, produced a different human response profile. Not random, not chaotic. Evolved. He sat with that word for a long time. Evolved. Because evolution implies time. But this was happening inside time frames that should not allow structural change at this scale. Mara F. entered his office without speaking. She placed a data cluster on his desk. He already knew what it contained before opening it. Human fleet count. Now exceeding 1,200 active vessels. Not built from expansion alone, but from continuous reconfiguration of production systems during active conflict engagement cycles. He did not ask how, because that question had stopped producing useful answers. Instead he asked, "What are they becoming?" Mara F. did not respond immediately. That was new. She used to answer quickly. Now she thought before speaking. Finally she said, "They are not becoming something else." The pause. They are becoming more responsive to pressure. Velerin nodded slowly. Yes. Then corrected himself. No. He looked at the data again. That is not accurate anymore. He leaned back. They are becoming indistinguishable from their response. That statement changed the room, because it removed separation between subject and behavior. On Earth, Commander OAE stood on the observation deck of a human fleet carrier. There was no ceremony, no announcement, only scale. Ships stretched across orbital space in patterns that no longer resembled early war desperation. They resembled structure, not chaotic growth, organized emergence. A commander nearby asked him if they were ready. OAE looked out at the fleet for a long time. We've been ready since this started. The pause. We just didn't know what ready meant yet. That sentence would later be recorded in quorum analysis logs as a key indicator of human cognitive warfare model divergence. Velerin received the report and marked it privately, not as threat, as clarity event. Meanwhile, Orerin stood before the council again. But this time the tone had changed. No one was arguing for escalation. No one was proposing termination strategies. The question had shifted. Not how to win, but how to interpret what was happening. Orerin spoke first. We are no longer outnumbered in capability growth rate projections. The pause. We are outpaced in adaptation rate. Silence. Then Mara If added. They are not scaling against us. Another pause. They are scaling through us. That distinction mattered. Because scaling against implies opposition. Scaling through implies utilization. Velerin finally said it clearly. They are using this conflict as input architecture. No one asked him to clarify. Because they understood. The council representative from Laurenti leaned forward. So what happens when we stop applying pressure? That question had been avoided for weeks. Velerin answered honestly. We don't know. Then added. We have no baseline model for them outside pressure conditions. That was the final break in the system. Because every predictive framework the quorum used required at least one stable variable. Humanity had removed that requirement. Not intentionally, but structurally. On Earth, something subtle changed. Not in military posture. In behavior. Human fleets stopped expanding aggressively. They stabilized again. But not into peace. Into readiness equilibrium. A state where expansion and restraint became indistinguishable. Velerin studied this pattern carefully. And realized something that made the entire classification system feel suddenly outdated. Humans did not escalate endlessly. They stabilized at the highest sustainable level of pressure they could continuously integrate. Not maximum aggression. Not minimum peace. Maximum functional adaptation state. He wrote it down carefully. Then stopped. because even writing it felt like forcing a system into a category it was actively resisting. Mara Eth stood beside him. We tried to map them using endpoints. Velerin nodded. They don't have endpoints. She corrected softly. They have operating states. Silence followed. Outside, the starfield remained unchanged. But the interpretation of it had changed completely. Later, Velerin submitted the final classification amendment. It was not labeled urgent. It was labeled corrective. It contained only one conclusion paragraph. Humanity is not a civilization that transitions through war. It is a system that incorporates war as a functional input condition. Not for survival, but for refinement. And all previous models failed because they assumed systems seek stability. This one does not. It seeks continuity of function under instability. After submitting it, Velerin closed his terminal. And for the first time since contact began, he did not try to predict what humanity would do next. Because prediction required stillness somewhere in the system. And humanity, as it now stood in the data, had none.